My name is John Mercer. I'm 58 now, but this story takes me back to my days as a forest ranger in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness near the Canadian border. The year was 1994, and I'd been with the service for over a decade. What happened on Shadow Lake still gives me chills. It began with a call from my supervisor. A fisherman, Doug Harland, had gone missing on a remote island where he'd camped with his lifelong friend, Martin Calloway. Doug's wife reported him missing after he failed to return as scheduled. My task was to check their usual campsite on Shadow Island, a secluded spot notorious for eerie tales of ghostly whispers and strange lights. As I prepped my boat, I got an unsettling update. Doug had been acting erratic before his trip, reportedly hearing voices and claiming spirits of the lake were calling to him. Worse, he was armed. The boat ride to Shadow Island was uneventful, but as I neared, I noticed an unusual fog lingering around the eastern side of the island. It shouldn't have been there. The day was warm and clear. I could make out a faint column of smoke rising from the center of the island. I docked the boat and called out, "Doug! Martin, are you here?" Silence. The silence was eerie. Shadow Island had always been uninviting, but on this day, it seemed malevolent. The usual chatter of birds and rustling leaves was absent. I ventured further into the woods, the weight of unease growing heavier with each step. As I approached the campfire, the first thing I noticed was the acrid smell of burning meat. Doug sat slumped in a camping chair. At first glance, he appeared to be asleep, but his unnatural stillness told me otherwise. His head lolled to the side, and as I got closer, the gruesome truth became apparent. A raven perched on his shoulder, pecking at a grotesque, gaping hole in the back of his skull. I stumbled backward, nearly retching at the sight. My hands shook as I reached for my radio to call for backup. But the horror didn't end there. My eyes were drawn to the campfire. The smell of burning meat now made a sickening sense. Chunks of charred flesh, human flesh, sizzled on the embers. Nearby lay Martin's body, or what was left of it. His legs had been severed at the knees, his face frozen in an expression of sheer terror. A bloodied butcher knife lay on the ground beside him. For a moment, my mind refused to comprehend the scene. Doug had carved up his friend and cooked him? The thought sent a wave of nausea through me. But something about the scene didn't sit right. The mutilations were too precise, too deliberate. This wasn't the work of a man in a frenzy. It felt calculated. And then I heard it. A low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the very trees. My heart pounded as I swung my flashlight around, searching for the source. The shadows cast by the firelight twisted and warped, forming shapes that didn't belong to the trees. For a fleeting moment, I saw them. Tall, gaunt figures with hollow eyes, their mouths open in silent screams. They seemed to glide toward me, their skeletal fingers pointing accusingly. Paralyzed with fear, I watched as the shadows advanced. The growling grew louder, resonating deep within my chest. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on a root. I hit the ground hard, the flashlight slipping from my grasp. The beam flickered wildly, casting chaotic shadows that made the figures seem even more menacing. Desperate, I scrambled to my feet and bolted for my boat. My breath came in ragged gasps as I tore through the underbrush, branches clawing at my face and arms. Behind me, the growling turned into a cacophony of whispers, a sinister chant in a language I couldn't understand. I didn't dare look back. When I reached the shore, the fog had thickened, swallowing the island in a ghostly shroud. I leapt into the boat and fumbled with the motor, my fingers trembling so badly that I almost dropped the key. Finally, the engine roared to life, and I sped away, the whispers fading into the distance. As the island receded, I dared to glance back. Through the thinning fog, I saw them. A line of shadowy figures standing at the water's edge, watching me. One of them raised a skeletal hand, as if in a mockery of a wave. And then they were gone, swallowed by the mist. I reported the incident to my supervisor, but the official explanation was mundane, a murder-suicide. Doug had snapped, killed Martin, and taken his own life, but I knew better. There was something on that island, something ancient and malevolent. It had taken Doug, twisted him into something unrecognizable, and it wasn't done. I never set foot on Shadow Island again. The memories haunt me to this day, not just the gruesome scene, but the sense of something watching, waiting. The lake took something from Doug. and whatever it was, it's still there, biding its time. My name is Sarah Lawson, and this happened when I was a 20-year-old volunteer park ranger during the summer of 1998 at Silver Pine National Forest. I had joined the seasonal program to gain experience for my environmental science degree. I expected serene days spent hiking and teaching visitors about conservation. What I didn't expect was a night that would haunt me for the rest of my life. It was late June, and I was tasked with boundary maintenance, walking along the park's outer limits to ensure fences were intact and trails were clear. I didn't mind the solitude. In fact, I welcomed it. The woods at dusk had a magical quality. The sunlight filtering through the canopy in golden shafts, birds singing their last songs of the day. But that evening the woods felt different. The air was too still, the usual rustling of leaves and animal sounds absent. I was walking near the eastern boundary, a remote area known for its rugged terrain and an old, overgrown cemetery, a place few ventured. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the woods cloaked in shadows. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I froze. Ahead, something moved between the trees. At first I thought it was a deer, but as I stepped closer, I realized it was a person, a girl, staggering through the underbrush. She was naked, her pale skin streaked with blood, her dark hair matted to her head. Large patches of her flesh were raw, as if scraped off, exposing the sinew and muscle beneath. She stumbled, then collapsed to her knees, her body heaving with ragged breaths. My heart raced as I approached her cautiously. "Hey, are you okay?" I called out, trying to keep my voice calm. She didn't respond, just kept sobbing softly. When I got closer, I could see that her feet were bare and torn, the soles shredded by the sharp forest floor. I took off my jacket and draped it over her trembling shoulders. "It's okay. You're safe now," I said, though I wasn't sure if that was true. She flinched at my touch but didn't pull away. "Who did this to you?" I asked, but she only shook her head, her wide, haunted eyes darting around as if expecting something, or someone, to emerge from the woods. I decided to carry her back to my truck. She was light, her fragile frame cradled easily in my arms. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The trees seemed to close in around us, the shadows deepening with every step. Then came the whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound grew louder, a low guttural murmur that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I quickened my pace, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The girl's sobs grew louder, her small hands clutching at my shirt as if she too could hear them. When I finally reached my truck, I placed her gently in the back seat and climbed into the driver's seat. The forest felt alive, the whispers now a chorus of incomprehensible voices. I slammed the door and started the engine, the headlights slicing through the oppressive darkness. The drive to the ranger station was a blur. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something chasing us. The girl remained silent, curled into a ball with my jacket clutched tightly around her. When I asked her name, she didn't answer. She didn't say anything at all. At the station, my supervisor, Rick, took one look at the girl and paled. "What the hell happened?" he asked, but I didn't have any answers. We called the local sheriff's department, and an ambulance arrived to take her to the hospital. I stayed behind, shaken, but relieved that she was finally in safe hands. Or so I thought. The next morning, Rick called me into his office. He looked grim. "They lost her," he said. I frowned. "What do you mean, lost her?" "The hospital. She's gone." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Did she walk out?" Rick shook his head. "Security footage shows a man in scrubs wheeling her out around 2 a.m. He didn't work there. Nobody knows who he is." My stomach turned. "Didn't anyone stop him?" "No," Rick said, his voice tight. "He had fake credentials. By the time anyone noticed, he was long gone. The police launched an investigation, but days turned into weeks with no leads. The girl's abductor vanished without a trace, and she was never seen again. But the story doesn't end there. That night I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, those terrified eyes staring back at me. Around midnight, I heard it again. The whispers. Faint at first, then growing louder, filling my small cabin with their eerie chant. I sat up, my heart hammering in my chest. The shadows in the room seemed to move, stretching and twisting as if alive. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it around, but there was nothing there. Just the empty room and the whispers that refused to stop. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the porch, the flashlight clutched in my hand. The whispers faded with the first light of dawn, but the unease lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd brought something back with me from the woods. Over the years, I've tried to put that night behind me, but I never succeeded. Every so often, I hear the whispers again. Always at night. Always when I'm alone. And every time I'm reminded of that blood-covered girl and the question that will haunt me forever. Who or what was she running from? My name is Daniel Holt, and I've been a forest ranger for over 20 years. Most of my time has been spent patrolling a small, quiet park in northern Montana. It's not the kind of place where anything extraordinary happens. At least that's what I used to believe. But one summer afternoon in 2004, I stumbled upon something that changed my life forever. It started as an ordinary boundary patrol. I was assigned to inspect an overgrown section of trail near Cedar Hollow, a part of the park rarely visited by tourists. The trail meandered through a dense forest of towering pines, their canopy so thick it blotted out most of the sunlight. The air was cool and damp, filled with the earthy scent of moss and decaying leaves. As I walked, I noticed something unusual, a patch of ground where the vegetation looked unnaturally sparse. The rest of the trail was covered in thick underbrush, but this spot was bare, as though the forest itself had rejected it. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stopped to investigate. The ground felt loose underfoot, as if it had been disturbed recently. I knelt down and began to dig with my hands, pulling away the soft earth. About 6 inches down, my fingers scraped against something hard. My heart skipped a beat. It was a wooden box, small and weathered, barely larger than a shoebox. The lid was held shut with a rusted metal clasp. Every instinct told me to leave it alone, but I couldn't resist. I pried the clasp open and lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in a faded piece of cloth, was a small bundle of bones. They were too small to belong to an adult, and the skull's oversized proportions made it clear they were from a child. My stomach churned as I realized what I'd found: the unmarked grave of an infant. I radioed my supervisor immediately. By the time he and a small team arrived, I had marked off the area with tape and stood guard, trying to keep my growing unease in check. When the forensics team unearthed the rest of the box, they made a disturbing discovery. The bones were etched with strange markings, not scratches or signs of animal interference, but deliberate carvings, as though someone had used a knife to etch symbols into the bone. The symbols were nothing I'd ever seen before. They weren't letters, numbers, or anything resembling a language I knew. One of the forensic experts speculated they might be some kind of ritualistic markings, but no one could say for certain. The box and its contents were taken away for further analysis, and I was instructed to close the trail to the public until further notice. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those bones, those strange, unnatural carvings. I felt a lingering unease, as though I'd disturbed something that should have been left alone. Around midnight, I heard a sound outside my cabin. It was faint, like whispering, but too quiet to make out the words. I stepped onto the porch, flashlight in hand, and shone it into the darkness. The forest was silent, unnaturally so. No rustling leaves, no chirping crickets, just a heavy, oppressive quiet. Then I saw it. At the edge of the tree line, a figure stood watching me. It was tall and thin, its body shrouded in shadow. I couldn't make out any details, but its presence filled me with a primal dread. I called out, but it didn't move. I pointed my flashlight at it, but the beam seemed to falter, as though the darkness around it was swallowing the light. When I blinked, the figure was gone. The next morning, I returned to the site with a colleague, hoping daylight would dispel the fear that had taken root in my mind. But when we arrived, the area was wrong. The trees around the disturbed patch of ground seemed darker, their bark cracked and oozing a black, sap-like substance. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and smelled faintly of sulfur. My colleague noticed it too. "This place feels off," he muttered, his eyes darting nervously around. We both agreed to finish our inspection quickly and leave. But as we turned to go, we heard a sound that froze us in our tracks. A child's laughter, faint and echoing through the trees. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his face pale. "Let's get out of here." We hurried back to the main trail, neither of us speaking until we were safely back at the ranger station. We filed a report about the strange atmosphere and the sound we'd heard, but it was dismissed as nerves and overactive imaginations. In the weeks that followed, strange occurrences became more frequent. Rangers reported hearing whispers in the woods, seeing shadowy figures moving between the trees, and finding dead animals near the site of the grave. The symbols on the bones were sent to several experts, but no one could identify them. One linguist suggested they might be a form of proto-language, something ancient and long forgotten. Then came the night I saw her. I was patrolling the park alone, checking for trespassers near Cedar Hollow. The forest was cloaked in darkness, the moonlight barely penetrating the thick canopy. As I approached the old cemetery, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned my flashlight toward it, and there she was, a little girl, no older than 5, standing among the headstones. She was pale, her hair dark and matted, her dress torn and dirty. But it was her eyes that struck me the most. They were pitch black, devoid of any white or iris. She stared at me for a moment, then pointed toward the trail leading to the grave. "What are you doing out here?" I asked, my voice trembling. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and walked into the woods, vanishing into the shadows. I followed her, calling out, but she was gone. When I reached the site of the grave, I found something that hadn't been there before. A new symbol carved into the tree nearest the disturbed ground. It was the same style as the ones on the bones, but larger, more intricate. I radioed it in, but by the time anyone else arrived, the symbol had disappeared, leaving behind only a faint burn mark on the tree. I don't patrol Cedar Hollow anymore. None of us do. The area has been officially closed to the public, the trail rerouted far away from the grave. But sometimes, on quiet nights, I still hear the whispers, faint and echoing, as if the forest itself is trying to tell me something. And I'll never forget the look in that little girl's black eyes, or the way she pointed, not at the grave, but at me. Whatever I disturbed that day wasn't just a grave. It was something older, something angry. And I fear it's still watching, waiting for the moment I least expect. My name is Mark Bennett, and this story takes me back to the final day of my career as a forest ranger. For 7 years, I worked in the remote wilderness of the Black Ridge National Forest, a sprawling expanse of valleys, ridges, and dense forests in northern Idaho. It was a place of breathtaking beauty and harsh solitude, but the events of that day in 1997 turned the serenity of those woods into a living nightmare. It was late October, and the first signs of winter were creeping into the forest. The mornings were cold, and frost clung to the edges of the trees. I was assigned to patrol an isolated valley known for its rugged terrain and treacherous trails. The valley had a reputation for being wild and untamed, with few visitors willing to brave its steep inclines and unpredictable weather. The day started like any other. I packed my gear, loaded my sidearm, a standard issue for law enforcement rangers, and set off just after dawn. The valley was quiet, the only sounds the crunch of frost underfoot and the occasional call of a distant bird. I'd been walking for about an hour when I heard it, a sharp, echoing crack that reverberated through the valley. At first I thought it was a tree branch snapping under the weight of the frost, but then came the searing pain in my left shoulder. I stumbled, my hand instinctively going to the source of the pain. Blood. A lot of it. My brain took a moment to process what had happened. I'd been shot. Panic surged through me as I dove behind a fallen log for cover. Another shot rang out, splintering the wood inches from my face. Whoever was out there wasn't hunting deer. They were hunting me. I scanned the ridges above the valley, but the thick trees and morning mist obscured my view. My radio crackled as I fumbled to call for backup. "This is Ranger Bennett. I'm under fire in Black Ridge Valley, requesting immediate assistance." My voice shook as I spoke, but I tried to stay calm. The dispatcher's response was reassuring. Help was on the way, but I knew it would take time. The nearest station was over an hour's drive, and that didn't account for the difficulty of navigating the rugged terrain. I was on my own. The shooter fired again, and this time the bullet struck the dirt just behind me. They were getting closer. I peeked over the log, my eyes scanning for movement. A flicker of motion on the ridge caught my attention. A figure in camouflage, blending almost perfectly with the forest. They had a rifle aimed directly at me. Adrenaline surged through me as I weighed my options. Running would make me an easy target, but staying put wasn't an option either. I reached for my sidearm, my hands trembling. I'd never had to use it before, but now my life depended on it. I fired blindly in the direction of the shooter, hoping to buy myself some time. The sound of my shots echoed through the valley, and for a moment, there was silence. I took the opportunity to crawl along the ground, keeping the log between me and the sniper. My shoulder throbbed with pain, but I couldn't afford to stop. As I moved, I became acutely aware of the unnatural stillness in the forest. The birds had gone silent, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. It was as if the valley itself was watching, waiting to see how the confrontation would end. I found a cluster of boulders further down the trail and hunkered behind them. My breathing was ragged, each inhale sending a sharp pain through my wounded shoulder. I pressed my back against the cold stone, trying to steady myself. The sniper didn't fire again, but I knew they were still out there. I could feel their eyes on me, a predatory gaze that sent shivers down my spine. I glanced at my watch. It had been 15 minutes since I'd called for backup. It felt like hours. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. Footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, crunching on the frosted ground. The sniper was closing in. I tightened my grip on my sidearm, forcing myself to focus. My training kicked in, reminding me to control my breathing and aim carefully. I peeked around the edge of the boulder and saw the figure emerging from the mist. They wore a hooded jacket, their face obscured by shadows. The rifle was slung over their shoulder, and in their hand, they carried a long, serrated hunting knife. "Why are you doing this?" I called out, my voice steady despite the fear clawing at my chest. The figure didn't respond. They just kept walking, their movements unnervingly calm. I fired a warning shot into the ground in front of them. "Stop!" I shouted. "Stay where you are!" The figure paused, tilting their head as if considering my words. Then they lunged. Instinct took over. I fired again, this time aiming for the attacker. The bullet struck their leg, and they fell to the ground with a guttural cry. I scrambled to my feet, keeping my gun trained on them as I moved closer. The attacker writhed on the ground, clutching their wounded leg. For the first time, I got a good look at their face. It was gaunt and pale, their eyes wide and unblinking. They looked almost feral, their expression a mix of rage and desperation. Before I could question them, the sound of approaching footsteps reached my ears. Backup had arrived. A team of rangers and local deputies emerged from the mist, their weapons drawn. Relief washed over me as they took control of the situation. The attacker was taken into custody, but they refused to speak. No name, no explanation, nothing. It was as if they were a ghost, a specter of the valley itself. In the weeks that followed, investigators uncovered a makeshift camp deep in the woods. It was filled with survival gear, ammunition, and disturbing writings scrawled on scraps of paper. The writings spoke of cleansing the forest and purging the intruders. It was clear the sniper had been living in the wilderness for months, planning their attack. To this day, I don't know what drove them to target me or why they chose that valley. Some say they were just a deranged survivalist, but part of me wonders if there was something more. The way the forest felt that day, the unnatural stillness, the oppressive silence. It was as if the valley itself had turned against me. I retired from the service shortly after the incident. I still love the wilderness, but I can't bring myself to return to Black Ridge. The scars on my shoulder are a constant reminder of how close I came to death that day, and the memory of those cold, unblinking eyes still haunts my dreams. The forest is beautiful, but it is also unforgiving, and sometimes it hides things that are better left undisturbed. My name is Lucas Hayes, and this story is from the summer of 2010, during my first year as a park ranger at Stonebridge National Park in the Colorado Rockies. I was young and eager, thrilled to work amidst towering pines, pristine lakes, and the kind of rugged wilderness I had always dreamed of exploring. But my enthusiasm was soon tested by an encounter I will never forget. It started with a missing hiker. A man named Patrick Groves, 42 years old, had failed to return from a solo trek up Whispering Peak, one of the park's most remote and challenging trails. His wife had reported him missing after he missed their agreed-upon check-in. As the rookie ranger, I was assigned to accompany an experienced colleague, Alan Reed, to search for him. Whispering Peak had a reputation. Locals whispered about strange disappearances, eerie sounds, and shadows moving where none should be. It was the kind of lore you'd expect in a place like this, and I chalked it up to campfire stories meant to spook outsiders. But as Alan and I set out, the trail's silence felt oppressive, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. The first few hours of the hike were uneventful. The trail wound through dense woods, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. But as we climbed higher, the atmosphere shifted. The usual sounds of the forest, birds, insects, the rustling of leaves, faded into an unnatural stillness. The only sound was the crunch of our boots on the gravel path. "You feel that?" Alan asked, breaking the silence. I nodded. There was a weight in the air, an inexplicable tension that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. We found Patrick's campsite just before dusk. His tent was still pitched, his gear neatly arranged, but there was no sign of him. A partially eaten meal sat on a rock near the extinguished fire pit, as though he had left in the middle of dinner. It was unsettling, to say the least. "Looks like he went up further," Alan said, pointing to a faint trail leading away from the campsite. We decided to follow it, even though nightfall was fast approaching. As we climbed, the forest grew darker, the trees crowding closer together. The wind picked up, carrying with it a faint whispering sound. At first, I thought it was the wind moving through the trees, but the whispers grew louder, more distinct, forming words I couldn't quite make out. I stopped, my heart pounding, and looked at Alan. "Do you hear that?" I asked. He nodded, his expression grim. "Keep moving. Don't listen to it." We pressed on, the whispers following us like an unseen presence. The trail narrowed, winding along the edge of a steep ravine. The moon cast an eerie light over the landscape, illuminating the jagged peaks and shadowed valleys below. That's when we saw him. Patrick was standing on a rocky outcrop about 50 yards ahead, silhouetted against the night sky. He was motionless, his back to us, his arms hanging limply at his sides. We called out to him, but he didn't respond. Alan grabbed my arm. "Stay here," he said, his voice low. "I'll go talk to him." I watched as Alan approached Patrick, my flashlight trained on them both. When Alan was about 10 feet away, Patrick turned to face him. My stomach dropped. Patrick's eyes were gone, replaced by dark, empty sockets. His mouth twisted into a grotesque smile as he tilted his head, as though listening to something only he could hear. Alan froze, and in that moment, Patrick let out a scream, a high-pitched, inhuman wail that echoed through the mountains. He lunged at Alan, moving with a speed and agility that didn't seem possible. Alan shouted, dodging to the side, and Patrick stumbled past him, teetering on the edge of the ravine. "Stop!" I yelled, running toward them. But it was too late. Patrick turned to look at me, his face contorted with terror and something else, something unnatural. Then he stepped backward and fell into the darkness below. The silence that followed was deafening. Alan and I stood there, staring at the spot where Patrick had disappeared. The whispers were gone, replaced by an oppressive stillness that felt even worse. We shone our flashlights into the ravine, but saw nothing. It was as if the mountain had swallowed him whole. "We need to go," Alan said, his voice shaking. "Now!" We retraced our steps down the trail, our pace quickening with every step. The forest seemed alive, the shadows shifting and writhing in the corners of my vision. The whispers returned, louder now, their words clearer. "Leave. Go back. Not yours." By the time we reached the campsite, we were both on edge, our nerves frayed. We radioed for assistance, but due to the remote location, no help could arrive until morning. Reluctantly, we decided to spend the night at Patrick's campsite. The night was long and sleepless. The whispers never stopped, circling the tent like a predator stalking its prey. At one point, I heard footsteps outside and unzipped the tent to look. Nothing. But when I turned back, I saw handprints on the outside of the tent, pressed into the fabric from the outside. When dawn finally broke, We packed up and headed back to the station. A search team was dispatched to recover Patrick's body, but they found no trace of him. The ravine was searched thoroughly, but it was as though he had simply vanished. Alan and I never spoke about what we had seen that night. The official report listed Patrick's death as an accident, a tragic misstep on a dangerous trail. But I knew better. There was something on Whispering Peak, something ancient and malevolent that didn't want us there. I never went back to Whispering Peak, and I left the Park Service a few years later. But the memory of that night has stayed with me, the whispers echoing in my mind whenever I close my eyes. I can still see Patrick's empty sockets, his twisted smile, and the way he seemed to listen to the mountain's call. The locals were right. Whispering Peak is cursed, and whatever dwells there, it's still waiting.